Welcome to the Bible Unfolded, where we explore the captivating stories and profound teachings found within the pages of the Bible. Today, we'll dive into one of the most pivotal events in the history of God's chosen people, the Exodus. The Exodus story is a powerful narrative of slavery, deliverance, and the establishment of a covenant between God and the nation of Israel. It's a tale that has captivated the hearts and minds of believers for centuries, and it holds profound lessons for all who seek to understand God's plan for humanity. So let's embark on this journey and unpack the remarkable events that led the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt to the cusp of the Promised Land. Along the way, we'll discover the unwavering faithfulness of God and the pivotal role of his servant, Moses, in shaping the destiny of the chosen people. Our story begins in the land of Egypt, where the descendants of the patriarch Jacob, also known as the Israelites, had settled and thrived for generations. Genesis 46:1-7. During the time of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, the Israelites enjoyed a privileged status in Egypt. Joseph had risen to a position of great power and influence, and he had used his position to save the land from a devastating famine. Genesis 41:37-57. In recognition of Joseph's contributions, the Egyptians welcomed the Israelites and allowed them to settle in the fertile region of Goshen. Genesis 47:1-6. For a time, the Israelites prospered in Egypt, and their population grew rapidly. Exodus 1-7, however, as the years passed and a new pharaoh rose to power, the tide began to turn against the Israelites. Exodus 1-8. The new pharaoh, who knew nothing of Joseph's legacy, grew increasingly concerned about the growing strength and influence of the Israelites. Exodus 1:8-10. He feared that if the Israelites continued to multiply, they might one day pose a threat to the stability of Egypt. To suppress the Israelites, the Pharaoh subjected them to harsh and oppressive labor, forcing them to build cities and work in the fields. Exodus 1:11-14. Despite this cruelty, the Israelites continued to thrive, and their population continued to grow. Exodus 1:12. Desperate to control the Israelites, the Pharaoh resorted to an even more sinister plan. He ordered the Hebrew midwives, who assisted in the births of Israelite children, to kill all newborn Israelite boys. Exodus 1:15-16. However, the midwives, fearing God more than the Pharaoh, refused to obey this horrific command. Exodus 1:17. Undeterred, the Pharaoh issued a decree that all newborn Israelite boys were to be thrown into the Nile River. Exodus 1:22. But one Israelite mother, Jochebed, refused to let her son meet this fate. She hid him for 3 months and then placed him in a basket on the Nile, entrusting his life to God. Exodus 2:1-3. As the basket floated down the river, the Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe and discovered the child. Moved by compassion, she recognized him as an Israelite and decided to adopt him, naming him Moses. Exodus 2:5-10. Unbeknownst to the Pharaoh's daughter, the child's own mother was hired as his nurse, allowing her to care for him in secret. As Moses grew up in the Pharaoh's household, he became aware of the harsh treatment his fellow Israelites were enduring. One day, he witnessed an Egyptian overseer brutally beating an Israelite slave. Overcome with rage, Moses struck the Egyptian, killing him. Exodus 11:12. Fearing the consequences of his actions, Moses fled Egypt and found refuge in the land of Midian. There, he encountered a group of young women who were being harassed by shepherds while trying to water their flocks. Moses stepped in and defended the women, allowing them to water their animals. Exodus 16:19. The girl's father, Jethro, was impressed by Moses' actions and invited him to live with his family. Moses accepted the offer and eventually married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah. Together, they had a son named Gershom. Exodus 21-22. While Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock on Mount Horeb, also known as the Mountain of God, he encountered a remarkable sight. A bush was burning, yet it was not consumed by the flames. Exodus 3:1-2. As Moses approached the bush, he heard the voice of God calling out to him. God identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he declared that he had heard the cries of the Israelites and had come to deliver them from their oppression in Egypt. Exodus 3:4-8. God then revealed to Moses that he had been chosen to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land. Moses, however, was hesitant, feeling unworthy and inadequate for such a task. Exodus 3:11. To reassure Moses, God performed a miraculous sign, transforming Moses' staff into a snake and then back again. Exodus 4:2-4. God also promised that he would be with Moses and would give him the words to speak to the Pharaoh. Exodus 3:12. Convinced by God's promise, Moses returned to Egypt, accompanied by his brother Aaron, who had been appointed as Moses' spokesperson. Exodus 14:16. Upon their arrival, Moses and Aaron gathered the elders of the Israelites and shared God's plan for their deliverance. To demonstrate that they were truly God's messengers, Moses performed the miraculous sign of the staff turning into a snake. Exodus 29:30. The Israelites were convinced that Moses and Aaron were sent by God, and they believed that the Lord had heard their cries and would soon free them from their bondage. Exodus 31. Moses and Aaron then approached the Pharaoh and delivered God's command, "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Exodus 5:1. However, the Pharaoh refused, hardening his heart against the Israelites. Exodus 5:2. In response, God unleashed a series of devastating plagues upon Egypt, each one designed to demonstrate his power and authority over the Egyptian gods. Exodus 7:11. The first plague struck the Nile River, turning its waters to blood. Exodus 7:14-24. The fish died, and the river became undrinkable, causing great distress among the Egyptians. Yet, the Pharaoh remained defiant, refusing to let the Israelites go. The second plague brought an infestation of frogs that swarmed throughout the land, even invading the Pharaoh's own bedchamber. Exodus 8:1-15, the Egyptians were overwhelmed by the sheer number of frogs, but the Pharaoh still refused to submit to God's demand. The third plague transformed the dust of the earth into swarms of lice that tormented both the Egyptians and their animals. Exodus 8:16-19, even the Egyptian magicians were unable to replicate this miracle, acknowledging that it was the work of God. Yet, the Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. The fourth plague unleashed hordes of flies that filled the land, but the Israelites were spared from this affliction. Exodus 8:20-30, faced with the overwhelming presence of the flies, the Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites go, but he reneged on his promise once the plague was lifted. The fifth plague struck the livestock of the Egyptians, killing their cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, and sheep. Exodus 9:1-7, yet the Israelites' animals remained unharmed, further demonstrating the power of the God of Israel. Still, the Pharaoh refused to relent. The sixth plague covered the Egyptians and their animals with painful boils and blisters. Exodus 9:8-12, even the Egyptian magicians were afflicted, but the Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he continued to deny the Israelites their freedom. The seventh plague brought a devastating storm of hail and lightning that ravaged the land of Egypt. Exodus 9:13-35, crops were destroyed, and livestock were killed. Yet the Pharaoh still refused to let the Israelites go. The eighth plague unleashed swarms of locusts that consumed everything in their path, leaving the land barren and desolate. Exodus 10:1-20, the Pharaoh finally agreed to let the Israelites go, but he later changed his mind, once again denying their freedom. The ninth plague cast the land of Egypt into a deep, impenetrable darkness that lasted for 3 days. Exodus 10:21-29, the Egyptians were paralyzed, unable to move or see, but the Israelites had light in their dwellings. The final and most devastating plague was the death of the firstborn in every Egyptian household. Exodus 11:1-12:30, God warned the Israelites to mark their doorframes with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes and spare their firstborn sons. When the plague struck at midnight, the cries of the Egyptians filled the air as they mourned the loss of their loved ones, including the Pharaoh's own son. Broken and defeated, the Pharaoh finally relented and ordered the Israelites to leave Egypt. With the Pharaoh's permission, the Israelites hastily gathered their belongings and set out on their journey to the Promised Land. Exodus 12:31-42, under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, hundreds of thousands of Israelites, including women, children, and the elderly, began their exodus from Egypt. Fearing that the Israelites might change their minds and return, the Pharaoh gathered his army and set out in pursuit. Exodus 14:5-9, the Israelites, trapped between the Egyptian army and the Red Sea, cried out in fear and despair. Exodus 14:10-12. Moses, however, reassured the people, saying, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. At God's command, Moses stretched out his staff over the Red Sea, and the waters parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. Exodus 14:15-16. As the Israelites hurried across the seabed, the Egyptian army pursued them. But when the last Israelite reached the opposite shore, God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff again, and the waters came crashing down, swallowing the entire Egyptian army. Exodus 14:21-31. The Israelites witnessed this miraculous deliverance and burst into songs of praise and thanksgiving to the Lord, who had rescued them from the hand of the Egyptians. Exodus 15:1-21. With the Egyptians defeated, the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, led by the cloud of the Lord by day and the pillar of fire by night. Exodus 13:21-22. However, the journey was not without its challenges. As they traveled, the Israelites faced hunger, thirst, and growing discontent. They began to long for the comforts of their former lives in Egypt, even considering the possibility of returning to slavery. Exodus 16:1-3, 17:1-3. But God, in his faithfulness, provided for his people. He rained down manna from heaven to feed them, and when they were thirsty, he instructed Moses to strike a rock, causing water to gush forth. Exodus 16:4-35, 17:1-7. After several weeks of traveling, the Israelites arrived at the base of Mount Sinai, also known as the Mountain of God. Exodus 19:1-2. It was here that God would reveal himself in a powerful and transformative way, establishing a covenant with his chosen people. Moses was summoned to the top of the mountain, where God spoke to him directly. Exodus 19:3-6, the Lord declared that if the Israelites obeyed his voice and kept his covenant, they would become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God then proceeded to give Moses the 10 Commandments, which would serve as the foundation of the Israelites' relationship with him and with one another. Exodus 20:1-17. These commandments included: 1. You shall have no other gods before me. 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol. 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. 4. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 5. Honor your father and your mother. 6. You shall not murder. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. 10. You shall not covet. Moses carefully relayed these commandments to the Israelites, warning them of the consequences of disobedience. Exodus 20:18-21. While Moses was on the mountain, receiving further instructions from God, the Israelites grew impatient and anxious. Exodus 32:1. They approached Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded that he make them gods to worship. Aaron, succumbing to the people's pressure, gathered the Israelites' gold and fashioned a golden calf, which the people then proceeded to worship. Exodus 30:2-6. This act of idolatry was a direct violation of the first commandment, and it angered God greatly. When Moses descended the mountain and witnessed the people's betrayal, he was filled with righteous indignation. He shattered the tablets containing the 10 Commandments and confronted the Israelites, calling them to repentance. Exodus 30:19-20. In the aftermath, the Levites, who had remained faithful to God, were instructed to execute those who had participated in the idolatrous worship. Exodus 32 to 25 to 29, this severe punishment served as a stark reminder of the seriousness of disobeying God's commands. Despite the Israelites' sin, God did not abandon them. He instructed Moses to construct a special ark, known as the Ark of the Covenant, to house the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Exodus 25 to 10 to 22, 37 to 1 to 9. The ark was a symbol of God's presence among his people, and it was to be treated with the utmost reverence and care. Two cherubim, angelic figures, were placed on the lid of the ark, representing God's divine protection and guidance. As the Israelites continued their journey, the Ark of the Covenant led the way, serving as a visible reminder of God's covenant with his chosen people. Numbers 10:33 to 36. After the golden calf incident, the Israelites faced a lengthy period of wandering in the wilderness, a journey that would last for 40 years. Numbers 14:33-34. During this time, the people encountered various challenges, including lack of food and water, rebellions, and the consequences of their own disobedience. However, God remained faithful, providing for their needs and disciplining them when necessary. The Israelites learned valuable lessons about trusting in God's provision, obeying his commands, and relying on his guidance. Through these trials, they were being prepared to enter the promised land, the land that God had sworn to give to Abraham and his descendants. Genesis 15:18-21. After for decades of wandering, the Israelites finally reached the borders of the promised land, the land of Canaan. Joshua 1:1-9. Under the leadership of Joshua, who had succeeded Moses, the Israelites prepared to enter the land that God had promised to their forefathers. As the Israelites approached Canaan, they encountered the formidable city of Jericho, a fortified stronghold that stood in their way. Joshua 5:13-605. God instructed Joshua to have the Israelites march around the city for 7 days, blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, the walls of Jericho collapsed, allowing the Israelites to conquer the city. This miraculous victory demonstrated God's power and his faithfulness to his covenant with the Israelites. The people were encouraged, knowing that God would fight for them and secure their inheritance in the promised land. With Jericho conquered, the Israelites continued their advance, facing and defeating various Canaanite cities and kingdoms. Joshua 6:12. The Lord went before them, granting them victory after victory, just as he had promised. However, the conquest of Canaan was not without its challenges. The Israelites faced resistance from the local inhabitants, who refused to submit to God's rule. There were also instances of disobedience and sin within the Israelite camp, which threatened to undermine their progress. Despite these obstacles, the Israelites, under Joshua's leadership, persevered and gradually took possession of the promised land. They divided the land among the 12 tribes, each receiving their allotted inheritance. Joshua 13:21. With the land conquered, the Israelites settled in their respective territories, each tribe taking its place within the nation of Israel. Joshua 22-24. This marked a significant milestone in the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham As the Israelites finally had a homeland to call their own, the tribes of Israel established their own communities, with each tribe maintaining its distinct identity and cultural traditions. They were united under the leadership of judges, who were raised up by God to guide the people and defend them from their enemies. Judges to 16:19. However, the Israelites' commitment to God's covenant was often tested, as they struggled with the temptation to adopt the pagan practices of the surrounding nations. This led to periods of spiritual decline and oppression, followed by the rise of new judges who would call the people back to their covenant relationship with God. As the Israelites continued to face challenges and internal conflicts, they eventually demanded a king to rule over them, like the other nations around them. 1 Samuel 8:4-5. God, though reluctant, granted their request and anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. Saul's reign was marked by both successes and failures. While he led the Israelites in victories against their enemies, he also disobeyed God's commands, leading to his eventual downfall. 1 Samuel 13-15. After Saul's rejection, God chose David, a young shepherd boy, to be the next king of Israel. 1 Samuel 16:1-13. David's reign was characterized by his unwavering faith in God, his military prowess, and his commitment to establishing a united kingdom. Under David's leadership, the Israelites experienced a period of prosperity and stability, and the kingdom reached the height of its power and influence. 2 Samuel 5-8. David's son, Solomon, continued this legacy, building the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the central place of worship for the Israelites. However, the unity of the kingdom was short-lived. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. 1 Kings 12:1-24. This division was the result of internal tensions and the people's failure to remain faithful to God's covenant. The northern kingdom of Israel, led by Jeroboam, quickly fell into idolatry and political instability. 1 Kings 12:25-33. The southern kingdom of Judah, under the rule of the Davidic dynasty, maintained a closer connection to the worship of the one true God, but it too experienced periods of spiritual decline and foreign oppression. Throughout the divided kingdom era, God raised up prophets to speak his words to the people, calling them to repentance and obedience. Figures like Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, and Jeremiah boldly confronted the kings and the people, warning them of the consequences of their sin and the impending judgment. Despite the prophets' pleas, the Israelites continued to turn away from God. As a result, the northern kingdom of Israel was eventually conquered and exiled by the Assyrian Empire, while the southern kingdom of Judah was later conquered and exiled by the Babylonian Empire. To Kings 17-123, 20-10-16. The exile was a devastating time for the Israelites, as they were separated from their homeland and the temple, the physical embodiment of God's presence among them. However, even in the midst of this darkness, the prophets continued to offer hope, proclaiming that God would one day restore his people and establish a new covenant with them. After the Babylonian Empire fell, The Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Israelites to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra 1:1-4. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of God's chosen people. Under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Israelites returned to the promised land and began the arduous task of rebuilding their lives and their relationship with God. They faced opposition from their enemies, but they remained steadfast in their determination to restore the nation of Israel. The rebuilding of the temple and the re-establishment of the Israelites in their homeland were significant events, as they represented the fulfillment of God's promise to His people. The Israelites now had the opportunity to renew their covenant with God and prepare for the coming of the Messiah, the promised Savior who would ultimately redeem them and all of humanity. The Exodus story is a powerful testament to the faithfulness of God and the resilience of His chosen people, the Israelites. From their bondage in Egypt to their miraculous deliverance, from the establishment of the promised land to the cycles of obedience and disobedience, the Israelites' journey is a reflection of the human experience, one marked by both triumph and struggle, but ultimately guided by the unwavering hand of the Almighty. As we reflect on this remarkable narrative, we are reminded of the enduring truth that God's love and covenant with His people are unbreakable. The Exodus story continues to inspire and challenge us, calling us to trust in God's plan, to obey His commands, and to find our own path to freedom and redemption.